Miss Thomason.
Can we bring up your inquiry statement again, please, Sergeant? And can we look at paragraph 53? We've looked at this before. The last sentence, usually you would be briefed about something like that, but because we had just come in to assist, that's where we were. Can I just be clear, when you went to the to Mrs. Rashid's family home, had you had a briefing, or had you only received the information that had been passed over radio?
The latter. All we knew, excuse me, all we knew was that previously an incident had happened in Kirkcaldy, but we didn't have any briefing. As far as I recall, I heard the radio message about people being within and seeking advice. I'm sure we phoned down to the sergeant because our CID office was a floor up. I'm sure we phoned down to say, look, we're going to go along and assist, but there was no sort of briefing. We weren't part of the sort of ongoing investigation.
Given the difficulties that you encountered when you got there, that you've told us about, might it have been helpful if you had had a briefing?
Yes, definitely. But it was a fluid situation. Everything was happening.
What sort of information might you have got at a briefing that would have helped you when you got to the house?
It's difficult to say, but going back to what was mentioned, I don't know if they knew at that time if it was clothing that we were looking for or anything like that. If we had had that information at the time, that would have been useful, because potentially we could have managed to obtain items that they were looking for, seize them, and then that way, if the evidence is seized and they weren't looking for anything else, potentially they could have had the householders remain in the house.
And if it hadn't been known at that point in time what the evidential value of the house might have been, would it still have helped you to have known a little bit more about the circumstances of the incident involving Sheikh Abayo and the connection to the to Mrs. Rashid's house?
Potentially, yes, because we're there trying to explain to the family, you know, why we're needing to seize this property, why they're looking to search it, and if we had known that Saeed had been involved in an altercation, if you like, directly before that, again, I don't know if they were aware of that at that time, we would have been able to furnish the family that information, and it would clearly sort of show more of a justification for our actions, if you like.
Thank you. I want to move on now to ask you some questions about the needs of the different occupants, the different householders at the property. And I wonder if I can ask you to turn to paragraph 43 of your statement. I want to begin with some questions about religion and culture and language. At 43, you say her mother was asking questions and Mrs. Rashid was translating to her mother backwards and forwards, and we made sure that she was happy, that she was understanding what was happening. I remember her telling us that her mother didn't speak any English. We made sure we didn't interrupt her or anything like that. We gave her sufficient time to ask questions to Mrs. Rashid, and Mrs. Rashid asked DC Petrie and myself. I tried to explain it, and then DC Petrie tried to explain it, and that's the way it went. We furnished her with all the information that we had. So you say, I remember her telling us that her mother didn't speak any English. Did you consider getting an interpreter?
No, I didn't. Not at that stage. Mrs. Rashid was asking us questions and asking her mother questions and interpreting back and forward. So, no, I didn't.
Okay. And why not?
I didn't think there was a need to be honest. It was her daughter that was interpreting for her, so I presumed that would have been more than adequate and probably easier for her mum. speaking to somebody that she knows.
And in a situation like this, where the person in the family who speaks English is trying to absorb information, make sense of that information, they're annoyed, they're asking questions, they're upset by what's going on, is it best practice to expect them to translate for family members too?
I don't know about best practice. I mean, that's I don't think particularly I would have done anything different as far as that goes. I mean, certainly if it wasn't witnesses we were dealing with, you know, and there were suspects or anything like that, of course we'd be using interpreters or people that are completely independent from the situation. But as far as I was concerned at the time and at this moment in time on reflection, I think it was probably best to have our daughter to do that.
And that's your assessment of the situation, but did you ask Mrs. Rashid? Did you ask her,
No.
are you happy to translate, or would you rather we brought in an interpreter?
No, I didn't.
And looking back, might you do that differently next time?
Yes, but by all means, yeah. I maybe should ask that question, but it wasn't something I considered, and I certainly didn't ask the question.
All right. When Mrs. Rashid gave evidence, she said that she was in her pyjamas. Do you recall her being in pyjamas?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't recall what she was wearing.
Okay. There was also evidence that she was wearing the hijab. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Can I share with you the evidence from Constable Fraser? This was on the 28th of August. He referred to the woman, that would be Mrs. Rashid, and her mother wearing traditional cultural clothing, and he was asked to describe that clothing. And he said colourful long dresses and colourful head. It wasn't a hat, it was wraps or something on the head, and he confirmed that both women had their heads covered. Does that fit with your recollection too?
As far as I recall, yes, that's correct.
And did you associate the clothes that Mrs. Rashid and her mother were wearing with any particular ethnicity, culture or religion?
I presumed they were Muslim just from the clothing.
So it crossed your mind that this could be the home of a Muslim family?
Yes, yeah.
And did you ask?
No, I didn't.
Were you aware of any matters you should be sensitive to when entering the home of a Muslim family?
No, not at that time.
Not at that time? Perhaps since?
Well, since I've probably learnt more about the Muslim faith through scouting than I ever done through the police. So in my spare time I run a group. I've taken cubs and scouts to a mosque and met with them and been to evening prayers and such like. So I've probably got a better understanding of their faith now than I did at that time.
So through the Scouts you've had a visit to a mosque?
Several, yeah.
Several. You've attended prayers and you feel you've learned more from that than you have through your training with the police?
Well, I knew I knew from going there. I didn't know at the time that females weren't allowed in the main prayer room, because I asked that the Cubs and Scouts, the female ones that were going, if they would consider wearing a headscarf, although they were admitting them. And I know the main mosque in Dundee, the prayer room for females is upstairs, so yeah.
And through the training that you've had with the police, have you ever had the opportunity to visit a mosque?
No.
Were you aware at the time that a Muslim family might prefer visitors to take their shoes off before coming into the house?
No, not at that time, no. But again, I'm aware of that with visiting the mosque. To be fair, I probably would have known that through our diversity training, but it wasn't something that I considered, if you like, at that time.
So can we take it that you didn't take your shoes off?
No,
when
I
you went
didn't,
in?
no.
Were you aware at that time that Muslim women might feel uncomfortable in male company?
No, I didn't.
Is that something that you know about now? Have you learned about that through your visit to the mosque?
Yes, like I say, unfortunately the only male in the household at that time was Abid. Mm-hmm. So he he couldn't hold a conversation too long, type thing. So otherwise we'd have probably sought out somebody. But I know our father come along, and obviously when he arrived, we dealt with him as the head of the household, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And Constable Aiken, of course, was a lady officer. She was outside. Was any consideration given to asking her to come in?
Not by myself, no.
Can we look at paragraph 66 of your statement, please? I've been referred to paragraph 42 of Mrs. Rashid's statement, in which she states that the officers who attended were uncaring, and I felt almost like we were being treated differently because we were Pakistani and Muslim. I'm asked for my reaction to Mrs. Rashid's description. They certainly weren't getting treated different because she was Pakistani and Muslim. We treat everybody in the same manner. We certainly weren't trying to be uncaring, far from it, but I could understand how she would maybe think we were uncaring on the aspect of getting asked to leave their house, and she's got a child that's just been out of hospital and stuff like that. It's far from ideal, but certainly we weren't trying to be uncaring, and we didn't treat anybody differently for being Pakistani and Muslim. So you say that you treat everybody the same, and you didn't treat anybody differently for being Pakistani and Muslim. Does treating people equally mean treating them the same?
Yes.
Can you see that perhaps it might be better to tailor the treatment of each individual to their unique needs?
Yes, yeah. In that case, obviously, as I've said, I know more about the Muslim religion now than I did then. So, yes, in that aspect, probably the knowledge I've got now, I would have been in a better position to treat Mrs. Rashid differently.
So treating people equally might actually involve treating them differently and not
Yes.
taking a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yes, yeah. I think what I'm meaning by equally, we treat everybody fairly, type thing. We don't treat anybody differently because of their religion, although we would, if you know what I mean.
I'm not sure I do know what you mean. Can you explain?
Well, Mrs. Rashid, I was asked to comment on that. She was treated differently because she was Pakistani and Muslim, and that's what I was trying to explain in that paragraph, that we treat everybody with fairness and respect, type thing. But as you've pointed out, we should have treated her for our religious needs better, type thing.
Can we look at paragraph 116? You say, I'm asked if I can recall whether I had had any training that would have included content on interacting with a witness who was Muslim, in particular a female Muslim. Yes, we would have had something along those lines. It's difficult to say. And at paragraph 117, when I first started in the police in '99, there wasn't the same knowledge of that, but certainly we've got a far better understanding of religions. But as far as training goes, I've probably got a better understanding through my own interactions with the Muslim faith. So yes, I don't think there's anything specific about a Muslim female witness, I would have to say. Maybe there is, but I don't recall it. And you reference there getting a better understanding through your own interactions with the Muslim faith. Is that a reference to what you've done with the Scouts in terms of taking Scouts and Cubs along to the mosque? And
Yeah, there's a particular badge activity they do called Our Faith, where they've to learn about a different faith. So predominantly where I reside, they're all sort of Protestant, some Catholics type thing. So we've reached out to the largest mosque nearby to go and learn from them. In turn, they've sent some literature, some short cartoons for the kids to watch before they go. and then we go down, visit them, go to the evening prayers. They're very good. They're in the washrooms prior to doing it. Before I kent where I was, all had their shoes, they've had their shoes off anyway, their socks off, and they're washing their feet and taking part and all the rest of it. And then they go into the evening prayers, and we speak with a man. He arranges for some of the youth to come along and recite some of the Quran, actually, which is quite incredible because they have to learn it verbatim, which is no tall order, that's for sure.
What's your role within the Scouts?
I'm the group scout leader in the area I'm in.
How long have you been doing that?
Too long. I was a cub leader, then a scout leader, now I'm the group scout leader. So we've got beavers, cubs and scouts. So we've probably 60 odd kids in our group.
How long have you been taking the children from your group to the mosque for these visits for their badge?
Probably the last 6 or 7 years, somewhere along those lines. The way the programme works, it sort of repeats itself every couple of years. And I know the first year we done it, I've been doing it for 10 years. The first year we've done it, we had a new minister in the area, so we just went to our own local church type thing. But after that, we sort of reached out, and I think I've been down 3 times now with Cubs and Scouts.
Okay. And as at the 3rd of May 2015, had you had that opportunity, or has this badge work with the Scouts post-dated 2015?
No, I hadn't, not at that stage, no.
And do you think it might have helped you on the 3rd of May 2015 if you'd had that opportunity to go to a mosque, to meet the imam, to attend evening prayers?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my previous understanding of our faith was it was quite a very strict faith type thing, but I was quite surprised when everybody was coming in for their evening prayers. They were switching their mobile phones off as they come along, and I was reflecting on if I'd been at not that I'm a church goer, but if I'd been at my own church, the touch that you would have gotten from the congregation upstairs with doing things like that. But no, certainly it was certainly beneficial to know, and it probably would have assisted me.
Mm-hmm. And looking to the future, do you think that sort of opportunity is the sort of thing that might benefit officers to receive as part of their equality and diversity training?
Potentially, yes. Again, it depends what areas you're working in. For instance, when I was stationed in Dundee, obviously, I think there's 6 or 7 mosques in Dundee. So whilst I was there, and this is post, obviously, this incident, I've had occasions to go to the mosques anyway and meet with leaders and community leaders and along those lines. But previous to that, I hadn't. There wasn't when I joined, I was in the North East Fife area. There's no mosques in that area, and there was one in Kirkcaldy that was under construction, I think, at that time. I don't know if it's finished as yet. So it would depend really on the individual, I would suggest.
And as at 2015, what equality and diversity training had you had?
We had training. I joined in '99, and I think it was about 2001. We had quite an input on diversity training. It came in at that time. My understanding is it was 2 or 3 days worth of inputs that we went to, and I think it was everybody was getting their diversity training at that time. My understanding is now when you join the force, you would get something like that at Tully Allen as part of your basic training, but certainly at that stage in my career, that's when we got our initial training. It was a couple of years into it.
So that was around about 2000 or the early 2000s,
2001, yeah.
2 or 3 days of training. And was there an input on the Muslim faith?
I think there was, yes. We had people that had come in from LGBTI and various other sort of workshops and things like that that had come in. But I can't honestly remember who or when they came in. As I said, it was a few years ago now.
It was a few years ago, and between 2000, 2001 and 2015, did you have any more equality, diversity type training?
Yeah, we usually have whatever happens, we've got a Moodle platform which has on sort of computer training type things that we do. So I'm sure there would have been diversity refreshers or something like that along those lines. I couldn't actually say what and when, but it would be down on our training records, which are electronic, what's done and when. And there tends to be refreshers. I don't know if there has been a refresher on diversity or not.
Have you had any training on unconscious bias?
Not at that time. It's mentioned now in officer safety training. When we undertake that, we do that, COVID out the way, but on a yearly basis we undertake it, and it's sort of mentioned at that time. Well, to the extent of restraining people, is what I'm meaning.
Okay, so unconscious bias in the context of officer safety training?
I don't think so, no. I don't think there's anything.
No, sorry, I perhaps misunderstood. I thought you were saying it was part of the annual OST refresher.
Yeah, it's me that's mistaken. I don't recall, to be honest,
All right.
whether that's in it or not now.
All right. We've spoken about Mrs. Rashid and her mother and their religious or cultural needs. I want to ask you some questions now about Mrs. Rashid's brother, who of course was disabled.
Mm-hmm.
Can we look at paragraph 45 of your statement, please?
Sorry I jumped in, but the unconscious bias, that was my mistake. We have had Moodle training on that.
An unconscious bias?
Yeah, I'm sure we have, yeah.
How recently?
Well, be within the last 2 or 3 years. We get a sort of deluge of packages that we need to do, but I'm sure there's been training, and I'm going to guess within the past year, 18 months, somewhere along that lines.
And through that training, have you been able to identify any biases that you perhaps yourself held unconsciously?
Not through the training, but I think everybody's aware of, everybody's got biases one way or another, but not through training, no.
Let's look at paragraph 45 now. I had that conversation with Mrs. Rashid, and then DC Petrie tried to explain to her as well. And then Mrs. Rashid phoned her father, I believe, because she needed his assistance to help move. I think that's her brother's name has been redacted. I think that's who she was phoning. He was going to come through because he had the transport. We did ask about that as well, if they were needing transport for him. But I think she said that her father had a wheelchair accessible vehicle for transporting him. So he was coming. And if we could also look at paragraph 54, please. The father was animated, and quite rightly so. He talked about the needs for, again, I think the son's name has been redacted here. And he was quite clear that he would have to get back into the house by 10 o'clock that night because the house was especially adapted for his needs, and that's what we were working towards. That was his bedtime. So we see from these two paragraphs read together that you were aware that Mrs. Rashid's brother was disabled and was in a wheelchair. And you were also aware that the house was specially adapted for his needs. Mm-hmm. Did you see any aids or equipment? You've mentioned a ramp and a special toilet that he was using frequently.
I wasn't through it. I'd seen the ramp because I was beside it, but because he was in a chair and they said that he was going to use the bathroom, it was quite clear that he would have a specially adapted bathroom for him.
We've heard evidence that he had a special bed. Did you know about that?
No, but again, I would have presumed that he would have had a some form of assisted bed for helping him in and out.
We've heard there was also a hoist to help him in and out of the bed. That doesn't surprise you.
No, not at all.
And you mentioned having seen the ramp that led from the living area
Yes.
to the bathroom. At paragraph 55, you say, I think Mr. Ahmed maybe mentioned about carers coming in at the time. So you were also aware that Mrs. Rashid's brother had carers who came in.
Yes.
And at paragraph 55, at the bottom of the page there, you recall saying to Mr. Ahmed in respect of getting access to the house prior to 10 o'clock, we can't promise you that, but we can promise you that we'll do everything we can to try and make that happen. What did you understand the difficulty to be if Mrs. Rashid's brother couldn't get back into his own house by 10 o'clock that evening?
Well, apart from the fact that it's his own environment and everybody's happier in their own environment, the issue was ensuring that was the time he usually retired to his bed, and carers would come in. I think it was just after 10, if I recall correctly, to assist him with getting him down to his bed for the evening. So it was clear that Mr. Ahmed was that was his main concern at that time. He had agreed to leave the property, but he wanted to ensure that he could get back into the property for a bit. So that's what we were certainly trying to make happen.
Let me ask you some questions about Mrs. Rashid's children. I don't think you saw the children at any time. Do you know how old they were?
No, I think one was a toddler, and I know there was one was only a couple of months old, or 3 months old or something. It was an infant anyway.
Mrs. Rashid said they were 18 months and 2 months.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Were you aware that the baby had had an operation and was recuperating?
Yes, that was mentioned, I think by Mrs. Rashid told us that, yes.
Were you aware that Mrs. Rashid was also recuperating, that she'd had an emergency C-section?
I don't think so, no.
Can we look at paragraph 49, please? This is the part in your statement when you explain that the family were making their preparations to leave the home. There was a period of time, it must have been half an hour or something, we were waiting and Mrs. Rashid was away getting ready, getting the kids ready. I never actually seen the kids. I can't recall where they were, but she was away getting changed, I think, and getting her stuff together. I remember on a couple of occasions at least, we had said to the occupants to remember that they had everything they needed because they wouldn't get access to the house again once they had left. And then at paragraph 50, when you're trying to secure a property, it's difficult because obviously they've got a right to privacy and you don't want to be looking at stuff that they're taking away with them. But again, you're mindful of, are they taking away any evidence or anything like that? We were as respectful as we could be without being intrusive or anything like that. But it's quite common practice if somebody's packing a bag or something that somebody observes exactly what they've taken out of the house in case there is something of potentially evidential value. As I said, it was far from ideal. So you're explaining here that what you were trying to do was balance privacy with making sure that evidence wasn't interfered with or removed from the house. And again, would it have assisted you in that exercise if you had known what evidence officers might ultimately be looking to recover from the house?
Yes, I would think so, yeah, because I think I'm probably thinking at that time, is it drugs we're looking for or that? So yes.
You say that you were watching the occupants to make sure they weren't taking away any evidence. What authority did you have to do that, to watch them in their own homes as they packed their bags?
Well, I wasn't watching them pack their bags. I think she was upstairs, but again, I think I'm talking in general terms about that. But certainly, I believe Mrs. Rashid went upstairs to get ready and pack her stuff. So I wasn't up there while she was doing that. And as I say, I'm talking more generally if we were if we had seized the house and somebody was taking stuff from within.
Explain how you were respectful. You say in your statement we were as respectful as we could be without being intrusive. How were you respectful?
Just by the way we were acting, how we were speaking, tone of voice, body language, everything like that. As I said, straight off the bat, we'd gone into that situation and I'm expecting a complaint to come in. So I'm very mindful about what we're saying, how we're acting and what we're doing. Because as I said, I mean, you know, when you've been a police officer, you know when people are going to complain. And as I say, she quite clearly was upset, so we were expecting a complaint. So we're trying to be as respectful, be as careful with our terminology and things like that, not to seem threatening or abrupt, as you said that we were, or anything like that.
How did you avoid being intrusive?
By giving her her privacy that she needed. So she went away upstairs to pack and get ready to leave. This was after her father come through. We had a conversation which was similar to Mrs. Rashid's about warrants and things like that. And then, as I said, he agreed that they were going to leave the property, and then we had this conversation about trying to get a beat back into the property for 10 o'clock.
I'd like to read you a short extract from Mrs. Rashid's evidence, her oral evidence, and then I'll invite your comment on it. So she said in her written statement that she asked an officer to let her have privacy, and she was asked to explain what she meant by that. And she said, "I was in my pyjamas, so I wanted to change because I didn't want to leave the house with my pyjamas on. And I wear hijab, so I didn't want him to be there. So I needed some privacy to change my clothes and get my children ready." She was asked, "Was the officer willing to give you some privacy?" And she replied, "He did at that point, yes." She was asked, "And were you able to change in one of the rooms in private?" "Yes." "What did the officer do when you were left in the room in private to get changed?" "He stood outside the room." She was asked, "Did he ask you if that was okay? Did he ask for your permission to do that?" She replied, "To stand outside the room? He didn't ask for my permission. I had to ask him." She was then asked, "How did you feel having an officer standing outside your room?" She replied, "Terrified, scared." "And it was a male police officer?" "Yes." Do you recognise her description of her experience of getting changed and getting packed to go?
No, not particularly. I believe she went upstairs to get changed. I was never upstairs, so I don't recall that.
Her evidence was that a male officer stood outside the room as she changed. Were you aware, I think you said earlier in your evidence, that to the best of your knowledge, neither of your male colleagues who were in the house with you went upstairs?
That's right, yeah. No, I'm not aware of that at all.
Is it possible one went upstairs and you simply weren't
It's possible,
aware?
yeah.
But your evidence is that you didn't go upstairs.
That's right, yeah. I went out to move the car.
In her oral evidence, Mrs. Rashid was asked how things might have played out differently, and she said, "By them caring about our situation, being a bit more compassionate towards us, about my brother's situation, understanding what we were all going through, but they didn't care about anything at all." She said she was made to feel like a second-class citizen, and the impact of this was that she didn't feel safe around the police anymore, didn't feel safe in her own home anymore. Can I invite your comment on that evidence?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry if she felt like that. That certainly wasn't anybody's intention. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry she felt that way, but we certainly weren't really aware of it.
Mrs. Rashid, in her inquiry statement, I don't think we need to bring this up, but for references at paragraph 11, said, I remember saying we didn't have anywhere to go and asking if they could search the house whilst we stayed in one room. They said we couldn't do that, and whether we went to a hotel or a relative's house was up to us. Do you recall that conversation?
Something similar to that. I mean, I know that that it was fed back to DS Dursley about them being within the house, and it come back, and we were told that that wasn't the case. We were going to have to encourage them to leave the address.
Do you remember the suggestion being made that the family could stay in one room? Do you recall Mrs. Rashid asking if that was possible?
I don't. I think I was asked that in my statement, and to be honest, I don't think it's something. Well, again, going back, if we knew what they were looking for within the address, it would have been helpful. But again, it's would have been quite difficult to do and manage because it's the time taken to potentially come and search the address. Again, trying to keep control of that situation and asking people to stay within the living room when you've got a gentleman with special needs, you've got 2 young kids in the house, and but no, I don't recall that being asked at all.
And Mr. Ahmed, in his inquiry statement, again we don't need to bring it up, but the reference is SBPI 249 at paragraph 9. He said that he asked, can we stay in the sitting room? That's the only room we'll use, the kitchen in the sitting room and the toilet next to it. But you don't recall anyone asking you whether that was possible?
I don't recall that. I'm not saying it wasn't asked, but I don't recall that. I think it was more along the lines that we had been informed that, you know, everybody had to leave the address.
And aside from you having had this instruction, you say, from DS Dursley that everyone was to leave, leaving that to one side, was there any reason why the family couldn't be kept within one area of the house whilst the search took place in the other rooms of the house?
It would be difficult to manage, but I think at the time I would have to say no, that decision wouldn't, but in hindsight, potentially they could have. If we knew what the locus was getting taken for, what we were looking for, there could have been potentially, and again, this is just my perception, that there could have been the potential to seize the clothing if they'd known at that time that's what they're looking for, and then we could have managed the scene, if you like, by everybody staying in the one area, in case anything else sort of come up during the investigation.
Because if the family had been able to stay at home, then it would have meant that Mrs. Rashid's brother would have had access to the aids and the equipment, the special bed, the hoist, the adapted bathroom and so on. He wouldn't have had to be taken from a familiar environment, and he would have been there when the carers arrived later that evening. So I'm just keen to understand what the barriers were to that particular course of action.
As I said, we were told that as far as I'm aware, the question was asked when it was fed back to the DS, and we were instructed that they had to leave the property. So, as I say, that's what we were doing.
And you say that instruction came from DS Dursley?
Yes. As I said, it was DC Petery that I had the conversation with, but that, as far as I'm aware, that's what we were informed, yes.
When Pat Campbell, the SIO, gave his evidence, he said that keeping the family in one area would have been a reasonable suggestion, a judgment call. He said, I think we probably could have controlled it a bit better with putting the family into one part of the house, maybe under some sort of controlled measure, with a police officer maybe present with them, for example, and carried out the search of the remaining part of the house. That may have been an option. Looking back, would you agree that that potentially was an option? I appreciate your understanding was that the duty sergeant had said everyone was to leave the house, but leaving that instruction to one side, is it something that you consider would have been a viable option with hindsight?
Yeah, definitely, and especially under the circumstances, as you've pointed out, with being in a chair and being within his own environment. Yeah, definitely.
And if a situation like this arose tomorrow, is it something you might think about doing?
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt, yeah.
And if the DS was telling you, no, I want everyone out the house, what would you do?
Well, I would be ensuring that all the information was relayed back to the pertinent people to ensure that the correct decision was getting made.
What time did the family leave the house?
Probably at the time, just when we left, I went out just prior to. I know DC Petery made contact again because the car was sitting in the driveway that had travelled back, and they weren't sure if that was connected as well. So it was sitting in the driveway, which was blocking Mrs. Rashid's car in at the back. So I went out to move that vehicle, and we opened up a brown production bag and got gloved up in that, so I could move the car out, wait for her to leave, and then I could return the car into situ, and then we took the bag and the gloves and stuff like that as productions, just in case we were interfering with anything that was pertinent to the inquiry.
We can look briefly at the scene entry log, please. That was PS 18504, thank you. And if we can turn to what I think is page 7 of the PDF. Thank you. So we see a record there of Mr. Ahmed arriving at the property at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to assist in moving his son, and there's a record of the places within the house where he went while he was within the house. Mm-hmm. And then a little bit down we see at 13:09 hours Mrs. Rashid in locus on police arrival, and again there's a record of the areas within the house that she was. So far as I can see, the scene entry log doesn't, I think, record the time that they left the property. Do you know why that might be?
I don't know, to be honest. That's so that's the information that's happened obviously prior to the log happening. So the officers are putting that in the pages to describe what's happened prior to the scene log being implemented, if that makes sense.
Okay, so it's maybe been a retrospective entry?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It actually says it at the top. So it's persons known to access the scene prior to commencement of the log.
So it does. You're absolutely right. But what this doesn't appear to record is the time that the family left the property.
No.
We know that you left at 14:45 hours along with DC Petrie. Did the family leave before or after you, or at the same time?
They left just prior to us. As I said, I moved the vehicle to allow them out. I think I was maybe sitting in the car. I made sure it started, and I just sat there, waited till she come out to her car, and then I reversed it out so they could get out, and then I put the car back in, and then we just bagged the stuff we had and left at that stage.
Can we go back to your statement, please, to paragraph 55? We've looked at this already, and if we look at the very bottom of that page, this is a conversation that you're having with Mr. Ahmed. I remember I said to him in respect of getting access back to the house prior to 10 o'clock, we can't promise you that, but we can promise you that we'll do everything we can to try and make that happen. So I'd like you to help me understand what you did to try and make that happen after you left the family's home at about 2:45 in the afternoon.
Well, obviously we've made contact and informed our supervisors of you know what's happening there. We've made them aware that of the need to get a bid back into the property for 10 o'clock, and the question was asked to see if they could fast track that locus, because obviously there was several loci about, so they were trying to make sure that one would be prioritised so a search could be done, and we could get a bid back into the address.
So who was trying to fast track the locus?
That would have been them in charge of the inquiry. It would have been DS Dursley would have been informed of that information, and I would presume he would have fed it back into the SIO.
Okay. Let me read to you a small extract from the evidence, the oral evidence of the SIO, Pat Campbell. He was told about the needs of Mrs. Rashid's disabled brother and the whole family circumstances. Mrs. Rashid had had surgery, as had the baby, and so on. And he said, if I'd had the information that you're now detailing, I think it's just common sense that we would have moved to a fast-track process for this and tried to move resources around to facilitate it. But, as I say, I wasn't aware of that information at that time. So certainly the SIO has given evidence before the inquiry that he wasn't aware of all of this information and the concern about the 10 o'clock deadline. But is it your evidence that you passed that information up the way, so to speak?
Yeah.
And did you do that yourself, or was it DC Petrie who passed the information up?
I can't remember if I spoke to Durs at all. I've certainly spoken to him since then, but I don't know at that time. I know we went back to the office and we made several phone calls, and that information was disseminated back. So they were quite clear of the situation that was there. So I don't know. I can't comment on that, to be honest. I don't know how they wouldn't know that. Because my understanding is that the locus was fast-tracked. Maybe I've gotten that wrong. So if they didn't know about that information, why was it fast-tracked?
You explain in your inquiry statement that you also, and this was perhaps by way of a plan B, tried to find alternative accommodation for the family. And you explain, and we don't need to go to it, but the reference is paragraph 102, that you spoke to an emergency social worker, but that on a Sunday morning no housing was available, and they suggested that you call the Victoria Hospital.
Yes, we were working on the assumption that what to do if we couldn't get a bid back into his home address, because it was quite clear that he was going to need special facilities. And all we could think of at the time was the Victoria Hospital. It would have appropriate beds, hoists, suitable toilets, things like that. So we were putting that in place, or trying to get something in place, because initially we contacted Housing, and they had nothing in Fife, and I'm sure they told us there was nothing in the Edinburgh area as well. So we knew Housing couldn't help us. So that was one of the avenues that we were looking at, just to see. I mean, it's far from ideal asking somebody to, well, not be admitted to hospital, but be in hospital when they're not needed. But that's what we were doing as a sort of belt and braces approach type thing.
Were the hospital able to assist?
No, we didn't get any sort of real positive feedback from them. We did make an initial inquiry, and again, that's something that would have been further explored if it got to the stage that they weren't able to get a feedback with an his home address.
And you explain later in your statement at paragraph 108, we could maybe look at that quickly. I'll read it short. In this paragraph, you explain that you phoned Mr. Ahmed to explain that there was no housing available, and you think that was just before you terminated duty. What time did you go off duty?
Off the top of my head, I mean, we were working at 7 till 4, or 0 some hundred, or 1600 hours, but we were on till 1830, 1900 hours, somewhere round about that, 1830, somewhere like that. I think I phoned them initially to tell them about the house, and I'm almost certain I phoned them, that was the last thing I done, to give them a final update of where we were as far as that goes, because we were obviously concerned to ensure that we could get a beat back into the property, because initially Mr. Ahmed was taking the beat to his shop in Kirkcaldy, which is far from ideal from anybody, and I think when I made the initial phone call, I'm sure he said he had gone to another family member's address, so we knew he wasn't in the shop at that time, but again, he's in a family member's address, so we were trying to sort that situation out.
And at paragraph 109, you explain that when you called Mr. Ahmed, he was far from content, very concerned about getting back into the property before 10, quite insistent, and rightly so, about the 10 o'clock target. And you say we made a lot of phone calls and very little progress, unfortunately. You've described phoning the emergency social worker. No housing was available. They suggested you call the hospital. That didn't come to anything. Were there any other agencies external to the police that you made contact with on behalf of the family to try to find accommodation in case the 10 o'clock target couldn't be met?
We were searching our own systems, looking for potential family members and connections and things like that, to see if there was an address that we could get a bid into.
And how successful or otherwise were these calls?
We weren't that successful at all with it. I mean, we were left with the situation that all we had was the address for a bid to get back to.
Okay. So you went off duty about 7 o'clock. As at the point in time that you went off duty, had the property been returned to the family?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
And at the point that you went off duty, had you been able to find alternative accommodation in case that became necessary?
No, there hadn't been any alternative accommodation secured. All we had was potentially further exploring the Victoria Hospital and maybe even a hotel if there was something available for that.
Can I move on to ask you to look at a letter? This is PS 03470. You said, Sergeant, that you anticipated a complaint. Are you aware that a complaint was in fact received?
Yes, I've never seen the letter, but we spoke to Inspector Brown, or Chief Inspector Brown, spoke to both myself and DC Petrie about it.
Let's look at the letter very quickly to give this some context. Stated the 14th of May, and it has come from the Fife Islamic Centre. Mr. Ahmed has given evidence that, in fact, he drafted this letter in his capacity, I think as he was either chairman or secretary, I'm afraid I'm not sure which, from memory, but he has an official role and drafted the letter in that capacity. And he explains, Fife Islamic Centre has for many years worked closely with Fife Police to address many issues and concerns of importance to the Muslim community. We acknowledge the hard work that Fife Police do. However, in this instance, we believe police did not act responsibly. The incident happened on 3rd of May, and the people living in the house was thrown out of the house, including a 7-week-old baby and disabled person, into the street without any explanation. As this incident has been reported to the Islamic Centres Committee, we are seeking a meeting with yourself to safeguard the safety of our Muslim community as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And if we can look at the response that Mr. Ahmed received, it's PS 03477. And as we work our way through the letter and get to the bottom, we'll see that it has, in fact, been sent by Tom Brown, the inspector you mentioned just a moment ago. But if we could return to the top of the letter, please. There's some pleasantries and an introduction then. On the 3rd of May 2015, officers from P Division attended an address in connection with an incident which had occurred earlier in Kirkcaldy. At that time, the officers were instructed to secure the premises as there was potential forensic evidence within, which required to be secured. On arrival, the premises were occupied by your wife, son and daughter. The police subsequently secured the premises and requested that the occupants found alternative accommodation until the forensic examination was complete. You have raised concerns that the police officers failed to communicate the purpose of their attendance fully to you, which resulted in confusion. Having discussed the matters with you in detail, it is clear that there have been shortcomings with regard to the standard of communication between the police and members of your family. It would appear that the requirement to secure potential forensic evidence has superseded quality of service. This should not have been the case. Whilst there is a balance to be struck with regard to what information is shared between the police and members of the public with regard to confidentiality, this should have been managed in a fashion so that you understood why you were being asked to vacate the premises. You have instructed that you do not wish to make an official complaint and wish the matter to be addressed locally. I consider the point you have raised to be upheld, and your perceptions have been brought to the attention of the officers in attendance. There's then a thanks and apologies for the unnecessary inconvenience caused. Have you seen this letter before?
No.
No, but you said that Tom Brown did speak with you?
Yes, he did, yeah.
Okay. And the letter says that Mr. Ahmed's perceptions had been brought to the attention of the officers in attendance. Did Inspector Brown bring these matters to your attention?
He did, yes. We had a discussion about it, and just as we've discussed today, we talked about potentially we should have gotten more information for the family at that time.
So was that a discussion that you had with Inspector Brown?
Yes.
So together did you reflect on what had happened and perhaps lessons that could be taken from it?
Yes, I would agree with that, yeah.
And what do you feel that you've learned from that experience?
Well, as I said, it was quite a unique situation that we found ourselves being part of, if you like, because normally the fact that the witnesses that were in the household we've been infants, young children and people with additional needs made it a lot more difficult than normal. But yeah, potentially we should have tried to get some more information from them. I believe DC Petre at that time tried to do that. He'd made contact, and unfortunately we furnished them with all the information that we had at that time, which wasn't a lot, but we should have probably reached out and tried to get some more information.
So do you feel that you've learned something from this experience?
Yeah, definitely. Every day is a school day, as I say, and could we have handled things better? Probably, yes. I don't fall out with that at all. I don't fall out with the family being upset or annoyed. I would be exactly the same if I was in their position.
And would you perhaps do things differently if you found yourself in the same situation in the future?
Yes, I would certainly try and get some more information and probably push to get more information, let's say.
Thank you. Sir, I'm mindful of the time.
We'll take a 15-minute break. Ms Thompson.
I wonder if we can look one last time at the scene entry log. And perhaps I can advise you that the inquiry has heard evidence that DS Dursley instructed two officers to trace and note a statement from Zahid Sahid on the morning of the 3rd of May 2015. And he began giving his statement at 2:30 p.m. on the 3rd of May. Now, if we can look at page 12, please, of the PDF. There we are. Do we see that Zahid Sahid arrived at his family home at 21:05 hours on the 3rd of May of 2015, and that was for the purpose of assisting the MIT in recovering items, and that he left his address half an hour later at 21:35 hours.
Yep.
Do we also see that DC Finch stood down or concluded locus protection at 21:35 hours? So it would appear that after the police noted a statement from Zahid Sahid, he presumably provided certain information that informed them as to what evidence they might expect to recover from his home, that with his assistance, the search was over and done with in a half hour. And of course, during the course of that afternoon, you had spent time, as you put it, trying to explain and persuade and reassure the family to leave so that their address could be secured and searched. And you then spent a considerable period of time making calls to the social worker, housing, Victoria Hospital, Mr. Ahmed, and doing your best to devise a plan B in the event that it wasn't possible for the family to return home that evening. But it would appear to be the case that had it been possible for the MIT to have brought Zahid Sahid to the address earlier in the day, and you certainly left at 2:45 in the afternoon, and the family, you said, left around about the same time, then it might have avoided the upheaval to the family, and might also have avoided you having to make all of the inquiries that you made in the course of that afternoon.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way. That's fair enough, yeah.
Okay. We can take that down from the screen now, thank you. I want to move away from the events at Mrs. Rashid's family home and ask you about a separate matter. Can we perhaps pull up your statement again and look at paragraph 103? Where you explain that you searched on CrimeFile, which was a crime system they were using at that time, looking for family members and addresses because we were aware that the father, Mr. Ahmed, had said he was going back to his shop. He had a shop in Kirkcaldy, and all this wasn't very conducive for his son to be in shop premises, which you could understand. Short term, when I say short term, I mean immediately, it would have been all right, but they were looking for a family member or a friend or some place for Mr. Ahmed's son to go. So this again, I think, is on the 3rd of May. In fact, we see in the paragraph above that you are talking about making contact with the hospital, which we know you did after speaking with social work. So you also searched CrimeFile looking for family members and addresses. Why were you looking for family members and addresses?
First of all, can I just explain, CrimeFile is an overall system. It has had accident file and things like that in it, so it's not to say that anybody was associated with a crime that would be on that system. It was very much all kinds of witnesses that would have been within there. So we were looking at potentially other family members or friends that would have a connection that we could maybe reach out to try and get some place to to go to.
Okay.
That was the reasoning behind that. But as I say, it's an overarching system.
Okay. And why were you trying to trace family and friends who might be able to help? Why didn't you just ask Mr. Ahmed or Mrs. Rashid?
I think we had initially, but again, we were looking on the presumption just in case we weren't able to get a bid back to the address in time. That's what we were looking at.
But would it not have been quicker and easier to ask Mr. Ahmed and Mrs. Rashid if they had family or friends who could support them in that situation?
Yes, it would have, but as I said, at that time they weren't there. Mrs. Rashid had gone back to Glasgow and Mr. Ahmed had gone back to his shop. So again, we were just looking for information to see if there was any way we could assist if the need be.
But you had a line of communication with Mr. Ahmed. You phoned him a couple of times, you said.
Yes, I think I maybe left a message once on his answering machine, though. I don't recall, but yes, I did have some lines of communication with him, yeah.
And did you ask Mr. Ahmed or Mrs. Rashid before the point in time that they left their family home whether there were any family or friends who might be able to help out if it wasn't possible to get the house back by 10 o'clock that night?
I don't recall exactly what was said, but yes, we would have asked something along those lines to try and see if there was some way to find a resolution, yeah. But again, they were quite unhappy and annoyed, to say the least, at that time. So we were going, sort of reflecting on what's happening and trying to find solutions at that stage.
Can we move on to another subject? Can we look at paragraph 122 of your statement? This is under the heading Race. I'm asked if I've ever witnessed any examples of racial discrimination, including racist jokes and comments, by police officers or police staff during my time with the police. Not really. I had one incident which I dealt with. When a call comes into the control room, they're encouraged to write everything down on Storm, and the comments and text added were inappropriate. The call taker had noted from the caller that the officer that he was trying to contact was called Rory. The call card read, I'm trying to get in contact with an officer called Rory, as in Rory the racing car. He's a coloured officer. This was brought to my attention by the officer in question, and I ensured it was dealt with appropriately. That had been taken from C3. I spoke to the officer, and he clearly was a wee bit uncomfortable. It was corrective advice given out, and he was content with it. But that's really the only racial thing I've had to deal with. I mean, we've had racial crimes, but not within the police, I would have to say. So this reference, Rory the racing car, can you explain the background to that reference?
It was just somebody within C3 had written something down completely inappropriately on a call card. It was an individual that was known to the police that was phoning in, and he was talking about a black officer, and that was the type of thing he was saying. Now, at that time, C3 were encouraged to write down exactly everything that was said over the phone, you know, from that. But that behaviour should have been challenged at that point. That wasn't acceptable, and a correction should have been given from them. The officer in question highlighted it to me. He was suggesting it was a humorous type thing because it had been brought to his attention, you know, from that, but it clearly wasn't right. So I ensured that I spoke to him on his own, and I made sure we made our inspector aware, and C3 was contacted and corrected advice was given out. I mean, there was no intent from the call taker to put something on like that, but clearly in that instance that should have been stopped, and you know, somebody using terminology like that.
Okay. What's that a reference to, Rory the racing car?
I think it's a cartoon or something, is it not? Something like that.
Okay. And so you spoke with the call handler and gave corrective advice? No,
I spoke with my inspector. I highlighted it with her, and she highlighted it. It was a different division. She highlighted it through their channels, and it was taken back. It's the way the system works. It's clear who's putting information on, so they were able to trace who had put the entry on.
Oh, I see. I beg your pardon. I think I've misread this paragraph from your statement. So it was brought to your attention by the officer in question. That's the officer whose first name is Rory, brought this to your
That's right,
attention. Is
yeah.
that right? I see.
Sorry, yeah.
No, it's my error, not yours. You ensured it was dealt with appropriately. You spoke to the officer. Is that the officer whose first name is Rory that you spoke with, who was uncomfortable? I see. Okay. Corrective advice was given out, and he was content with that. But the corrective advice wasn't given out by you?
No,
No. Who was responsible for giving the corrective advice?
it would have been the call taker's line manager, I would presume.
And is this a matter that was referred to professional standards?
No.
No. In what circumstances would something of
The-
be referred or not?
Well, there clearly wasn't any intent by the person to cause offence by writing that down there. If there was a sort of racial incident of any kind, you would refer it to professional, to PSD. You'd raise a memo and refer it to them for their attention.
You say that's the only incident that you've had to deal with, and you say in the next paragraph of your statement that you haven't heard racist jokes, or not in the context of policing.
No, not now. Certainly, when I started, there was a few dinosaurs. It's probably the best way to describe it, kicking about, that were maybe a bit inappropriate with some of the things I said, but not nowadays. Everybody's go back to the diversity training in 2001. You know, we've evolved. Officers and young people that come into policing now know exactly what's acceptable and what's not. So you tend to find that the majority of officers, I mean, they're just a cross-section of the population at the end of the day, but everybody knows where my values sit, so I've certainly not been party to any sort of racial comments or anything like that.
You mentioned there your diversity training, and we spoke about that a little bit earlier. I just have one final question really to ask you in connection with training before we conclude your evidence, and I wanted to ask what training you had received prior to 2015 and perhaps more recently than that in relation to seizure and search of properties, powers that you have, what to do if householders won't consent, that sort of thing. Have you had any training on those issues?
Well, at that stage, you get your initial training when you join the police. We would have our detective training at that time. It was a month's course that you would go, and you'd study case law, various things like that while you were there, and you'd have inputs from crime scene managers, fiscals, various other pathologists, whatever. So those sort of things would be discussed. The rights and wrongs of seizing stuff. You know, if you were in a property looking for drugs and you find a firearm, obviously you have to stop and then go and get an additional warrant, because that's not what you're looking for, that kind of thing. But apart from that, I can't say what sort of training other than your sort of initial, your detective training, and then we have all these Moodles that we tend to do.
Thank you. Can you bear with me just a moment?
Of course.
Have you no further questions before we get to my examination, sir?
Are there any Rule 9 applications? Sergeant Miller, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. We're about to rise for the day, and you'll then be free to go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Inquiry will adjourn.